I've always believed the softest burdens are the hardest to carry. They don't announce themselves with shouting matches or slam doors. Instead, they accumulate in the quiet hours, unspoken requests, silent expectations, and the invisible ledger of what we give up for the people we love. My name is Harper Lane, and if you passed me on a crowded street in Ann Arbor, Michigan, you probably wouldn't notice me. But I'm the one who remembers everyone's birthday, the one who slips out early to clean up after Thanksgiving, the one who shows up when no one else will. This is a story about what happens when the person holding it all together finally lets go. Growing up, I thought family was something solid like the house you lived in or the tree you climbed in your backyard. My mother, Kathy, had a way of making everything look effortless. But even as a little girl, I sensed the tension behind her smile. My father, Walter, believed in hard work and keeping your feelings to yourself. Then there was my older brother, Noah, the golden boy, the one who seemed to catch every break. I was the quiet one, the helper content to exist in the margins as long as I was needed. But need is a funny thing. It doesn't always come dressed as love. Sometimes it feels like obligation, a steady pressure that shapes your days and your sense of self. I remember the year Noah broke his arm right before Christmas. Everyone rushed to his side, rearranged holiday plans, and turned our living room into a makeshift recovery suite. I was 7, quietly setting out cookies for Santa, watching from the doorway as laughter filled the air, a spectator at my own family gathering. As I got older, that role never really changed. Birthdays came and went, mine barely a footnote. Noah's a parade. I learned to keep my expectations small, my gratitude big, and my disappointments hidden. If you asked me then, I would have said I was lucky. I had a family, a roof overhead, and plenty of stories to fill a scrapbook. What I didn't have was a place at the center of anyone's world. Maybe that's what made me so good at giving. I was always hoping someone would finally see me. It's easy, I think, to mistake being needed for being loved. That confusion followed me into adulthood, guiding my choices and anchoring me to people who expected everything and thanked me for nothing. When Noah struggled after college, I was the first to help. When Sophie, his daughter, needed a tutor or a birthday gift, I never hesitated. My parents grew older, more comfortable relying on the habits I'd built around them. Somewhere along the way, helping out became holding up, and the weight of it settled quietly on my shoulders. This isn't a story of dramatic fights or one unforgettable betrayal. It's a story made of 1,000 small cuts, a slow realization that sometimes the only way to find peace is to put down what isn't yours to carry. For anyone who has ever felt invisible in a room full of people they love, for anyone who has ever wondered if their absence would even register, I want to tell you you're not alone and your story matters. Because what happens when the person who always says yes finally learns to say no? What happens when you realize that love without respect is just another form of erasure? Today, I invite you to walk with me through the years and the lessons that led to the moment I reclaim my own story. Maybe you'll recognize a little of yourself or someone you love in these chapters. Maybe, like me, you'll discover that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply let go. If you ever grew up in a small American town, you might know the quiet rhythm of ordinary days. The sound of a screen door closing the neighbor's lawnmower, humming the laughter of children echoing across a patchwork of backyards. For me, childhood in Ann Arbor wasn't marked by grand events, but by tiny moments that stitched themselves into memory. Saturday mornings in our yellow kitchen, the smell of cinnamon rolls my mother humming along to Carole King while I set out the plates. My father, always up early, would ruffle my hair on his way to work, a silent approval I learned to chase. And then there was Noah, my big brother, 5 years older, loud, where I was quiet, quick to take the lead. The kind of kid teachers remembered for all the right reasons. I adored him the way little sisters often do, always trying to keep up, always hoping to earn a sliver of his sunlight. I didn't realize it then, but I was already learning the art of fading into the background. When family stories were told around the dinner table, mine were the details that filled in the gaps, never the headline. At school, I was the one the teachers could trust to stay late and straighten chairs, the one who returned every borrowed book. My mother called me her reliable girl, a badge I wore with pride, not knowing yet how easily reliability could turn into invisibility. Sometimes I wonder if she knew what she was teaching me, that to be loved was to be useful, to be seen was to serve. On holidays, I played stage manager, wrapping gifts for others, making cards, arranging place settings while Noah was celebrated front and center for his latest science award or soccer goal. I remember the Christmas when he got a brand new mountain bike, shiny red with silver spokes, while I unwrapped a sweater hand-me-down from a cousin. "You're such a good sport, Harper," Mom said, squeezing my shoulder. I smiled because that's what good sports do. There's an odd comfort in patterns even when they hurt. Every birthday I spent blowing out candles on a half-eaten sheet cake, no friends invited. No fuss became another quiet lesson in how to shrink my expectations. I learned to measure love in little things the way my mother would save the last pancake for me. The rare days my father remembered to ask how my test went. And yet I noticed the scales always tipped toward Noah. He didn't mean to take up so much space. The world simply offered it to him. Once, after a spelling bee where I placed second, my teacher told my parents, "She's so steady, that Harper. Always the helper." My mom nodded, eyes already drifting to Noah, who was demonstrating how he'd scored the winning goal last Saturday. I don't think anyone meant to make me small. Sometimes families carve out roles for each other so early that by the time you notice the shape of your life is already set. As I grew, so did my sense of responsibility. If the dog needed walking, I'd grab the leash. If Mom was tired, I'd clean the kitchen. I got used to hearing, "What would we do without you, Harp?" but only as an afterthought, never a centerpiece. The summer Noah left for college, the house felt emptier, quieter, like a radio turned too low. My parents grieved the change in the air. I filled the silence by doing more chores, more kindness, more holding things together. That's how I spent high school, the reliable daughter, the friend who always showed up, the girlfriend who didn't ask for much. My first boyfriend, Eric, once told me, "You're easy to love, Harper. You don't make things complicated." I thought it was a compliment until much later, when I realized he meant I was easy to overlook. Looking back, I see how early these patterns took root. It's a strange thing how children internalize the smallest moments, the praise for staying quiet, the thank yous for being helpful, the quick apologies when your needs slip through the cracks. I grew into a young woman who prided herself on never asking for help, who could juggle a dozen crises without flinching, who learned to keep her heartbreaks silent. I watched as Noah's world expanded college, career, marriage, a baby girl named Sophie who brought new light into our family. I adored my niece, poured time and energy into being her favorite aunt. But the old pattern stayed when there was an emergency. It was Harper who answered. When bills piled up or school projects needed supplies or family holidays had to be organized, I was the quiet force in the background, making everything work. If I ever hesitated, the look said, "Enough, we need you, Harper. Don't let us down." The need never sounded like love, it sounded like a job. If you've ever been the reliable one, you might understand. This people get used to your steadiness, your willingness to absorb chaos. They forget to check if you're tired. They don't see when you're lonely or when you wish just once to be the one everyone celebrates. In American culture, we talk a lot about self-made success, about independence and standing out. But families can be their own closed systems with rules that make it hard to change your place in the order of things. I didn't know how to break the cycle. I only knew how to keep moving forward, hoping that one day someone might turn to me, not for help, but just to see how I was doing. The lesson I wish I'd learned sooner is this: love and service aren't always the same thing. Families, even the best-intentioned ones, sometimes teach us that our value lies in what we can provide, not in who we are. It took me decades to realize I was more than the sum of what I could offer. I wish I could go back and tell the little girl who blew out candles alone that she was already enough just by existing. But the only way out of old stories is to start writing new ones, even if it feels scary. The patterns we inherit can be broken, and the love we seek may already be waiting for us if we're willing to claim it. And so, as the years passed and my role in the family grew more defined, I found myself standing on the threshold of a new kind of awareness. The next chapters of my life would test everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and what it means to finally step into the center of your own story. This is where my journey truly begins. Not with an act of rebellion, but with a quiet, necessary question. What happens when the one who holds everything together finally lets go? If you've ever asked yourself the same thing, maybe you'll find something here to hold on to. Let me tell you how it started for me. There's a strange kind of pride in being the one everyone counts on, and for a long time, it was the thread that stitched my adult life together. After college, I moved back to Ann Arbor not because I had to, but because it felt expected. My parents' house needed repairs. Noah was busy building a new family, and there were always a dozen small emergencies, swirling around us like gnats you just learned to ignore. I rented a small apartment across town, convinced I'd stay only until things settled down. But the truth about chaos is that it never really settles. It just finds a new host. I was that host, and every day I tried to make it look effortless. My days became a patchwork of errands, favors, and quiet interventions. When Sophie's daycare bill went unpaid, I covered it and made up an excuse about a clerical error. When my mother's car broke down, I lent her mine for weeks and biked to work in the rain. Noah's work drama became my midnight phone call, his financial shortfalls a puzzle I solved with careful budgeting and less sleep. It wasn't heroism, it was habit. I told myself that family helps family, that this was just a rough patch. But years passed and the rough patch became the road itself. Each time I bailed someone out, I promised myself it was the last, but I kept showing up, because that's what reliable people do. The only thing that changed was how invisible the help became. After a while, no one even noticed when things went smoothly, they just expected it. The truth is, in America, we're raised on stories about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and making your own way. But real life is messier. Families get tangled, roles calcify, and sometimes the helper becomes the pillar, holding up everyone else's dreams. I saw it play out with friends too, a roommate who paid her sister's rent, a coworker who nursed her dad through cancer alone. We all told ourselves it was temporary, that we could manage. We swapped tips on budgeting, on sneaking in self-care between obligations, on how to say no without feeling like traitors. But the guilt of not doing enough always hovered in the background, fueled by subtle reminders. We're so lucky to have you, Harper. I don't know what we'd do if you weren't here. No one asked how I was managing or what I might need. I learned to swallow resentment to cheer for others' milestones, even as I quietly put off my own. The hardest part wasn't the money or the lost weekends. It was the gradual erosion of boundaries. There's a particular pain in watching your own plans evaporate in the face of someone else's crisis. I still remember the year I was offered a project lead at work, a job that would have meant travel longer hours, maybe even a move to Chicago. I was excited and terrified for once, thinking of what I wanted instead of what I owed. But then Noah called. He'd lost his job. Alyssa was panicking. Sophie's tuition was overdue. My parents couldn't help, so the call came to me. I said yes to them and no to the promotion. The decision looked selfless from the outside, but inside, it chipped away at something I couldn't get back. Afterward, Noah barely mentioned it again. When Sophie's next birthday rolled around, I got a text. Can you pick up the cake, as if the rest of my life didn't exist? The sacrifices that kept everyone afloat faded into the background, unnoticed and unacknowledged. If I could offer one lesson from those years, it's this: boundaries are not a betrayal. They're a blueprint for sustainable love. The more you give without limits, the more people will take without question. It's not because they're cruel, but because need is insatiable, and in families the lines blur fast. American culture admires the caretaker, the one who steps up, but rarely asks what it costs them. We admire independence, yet expect certain people, especially women, especially daughters, to hold the family together with invisible thread. For a long time, I convinced myself that the love I gave would eventually circle back, that someday the people I rescued would see me not just my utility, but rescue is a thankless job. It's hard to break the cycle once it starts, especially when everyone's comfort depends on your silence. Sometimes late at night, I'd lie awake and picture the life I might have had, one where I traveled, built a career, maybe fell in love with someone who saw me as more than a fixer. But each morning I'd get up and start again, because starting over felt more terrifying than staying stuck. I wish I could say there was a single event that made me wake up, but it was really a slow dawning, the steady ache of being taken for granted. You learn eventually that sacrificing your dreams for others won't make them love you more. It just teaches them to expect less from themselves and more from you. The first step to freedom is realizing that you can't fill from an empty cup, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let others learn to stand. As these realizations slowly sank in, I found myself questioning the pattern I'd accepted for so long. Did I really want to live out the rest of my days as the silent safety net for people who didn't notice the difference between gratitude and expectation? Each new crisis felt heavier, each favor a little more like a demand. I began to sense deep down that change was coming, whether I wanted it or not. And while fear still held me back, there was a growing seed of defiance. Maybe it was time to ask what I deserved, not just what I could provide. This quiet unrest would become the turning point that led me to the next chapter, when the longing for belonging finally collided with the need to be seen not for what I could give, but for who I truly was. It's funny how holidays can magnify the things we wish were smaller. In every American movie, Thanksgiving means laughter, a crowded table, someone carving the turkey while kids argue about football. In my family, the table was always set with tradition candles, flickering in Grandma Lane's old brass holders, linen napkins folded into triangles, the scent of sage and cinnamon drifting through the house. I love the rituals, but somewhere between setting the plates and pouring the cider, I began to realize that tradition can become a script, and sometimes you don't get cast in the part you hope for. One Thanksgiving. A few years after Noah's daughter Sophie was born, I arrived with my usual bag of groceries and homemade pie. My mother barely looked up from the stove. "Could you set the kids' table in the den?" Harper, she asked. I smiled and did as I was told, arranging miniature forks and paper napkins printed with cartoon pumpkins. The kids' table, what a simple phrase, but what a heavy message. I was 34. That year, when dinner was ready, everyone else squeezed around the big oak table in the dining room. Noah's family, my parents, Alyssa's parents. There wasn't room for me, apparently, so I sat with Sophie and her cousins cutting turkey into bite-sized pieces, while laughter echoed from the next room. When someone remembered me, it was to ask for more gravy or pass another roll. I tried to pretend it was fine, but inside I felt a chill colder than any Michigan November. That wasn't the only time. At Christmas, I watched as gift piles grew lopsided, Noah unwrapping gadgets and new clothes, Alyssa with a shiny bracelet, Sophie with her mountain of toys. My presents were always practical. A kitchen towel set, a candle, a pair of gloves. I told myself not to mind. After all, I'd helped buy half the gifts under the tree shopping for everyone wrapping late into the night while the rest of the house slept. There were even years when my birthday was forgotten, entirely lost in the shuffle between school projects and Noah's work deadlines. "We'll celebrate next weekend," my mother would say, but by then it was always too late and I was too tired to care. You start to notice these patterns even when you try to ignore them. There was the group text for family game night, where somehow I was always the last to know. The inside jokes I didn't understand because no one thought to fill me in. The times when plans were made around Noah's schedule, Alyssa's book club, Sophie's swim meets my own life invisible, even as I quietly arranged my days around theirs. I saw it happen in other families too. A friend confided that her siblings never invited her to their annual cabin trip, always coming up with reasons after the fact. Another coworker spent Christmases alone, sending presents to nieces and nephews who barely remembered to text thanks. We all learned in different ways that exclusion doesn't always mean being sent away. Sometimes it means being forgotten quietly, as if you were never there. It took me a long time to understand that my place at the kids' table was more than a seating arrangement. It was a metaphor for the space I was allowed to occupy in my own family. No matter how much I gave, how present I made myself, there was an invisible line I couldn't cross, a boundary drawn by years of habit, unspoken alliances, and a silent agreement about who mattered most. I tried everything to be included, volunteering for extra chores, buying thoughtful gifts, making myself indispensable. But the more I tried, the more I seemed to fade my efforts, absorbed into the fabric of family life, never to be mentioned or celebrated. If there's one lesson I learned, it's this: you can't force your way into someone else's circle, no matter how much love you pour in. Belonging isn't a reward for good behavior or hard work. It's a birthright, a gift that comes when people choose to see you, not just for what you do, but for who you are. When that's missing, even the brightest holidays can leave you feeling like an extra in your own life. I used to think that if I just tried harder, gave more, someone would finally notice, and the next year I'd be at the big table, part of the laughter. But families are like rivers sometimes. The current simply flows around you no matter how long you stand in place. Still, I tried to make the best of it. On those quiet drives home from family gatherings, the roads glittering with fresh snow, I'd turn on old folk songs and let myself feel whatever I needed to feel. Sometimes I cried. Sometimes I just sang along my breath, making little clouds on the windshield. I told myself stories about next year, about how things might change, about the possibility that love could grow in places where it hadn't taken root before, and sometimes that hope was enough to keep me going. But as the years passed, the emptiness at those holiday tables began to feel like a warning, not a passing cloud. I started to wonder what it would mean to set a table of my own, to stop waiting for an invitation that might never come. And so, with every birthday, missed every quiet Christmas, every Thanksgiving spent carving turkey for the kids, something inside me shifted. I began to question whether my longing to belong was worth the ache it brought. The next chapter of my life would test that question in ways I couldn't yet imagine. For if family gatherings could leave me lonelier than any solitary night, maybe it was time to listen to that loneliness and see where it might lead. Sometimes, before we change our lives, we have to sit with the empty chair and ask ourselves, what do I truly want to fill it with? That's where my story turns next, when a single careless comment would finally break the spell I'd been living under and force me to choose myself. It's remarkable, really, how a single sentence can redraw the entire map of your heart. For years, I'd told myself that love was simply quieter in my family, that maybe I just didn't know how to hear it right. But sometimes what breaks us open isn't thunder or confrontation. It's a whisper meant to sting, dressed up as a joke floating in a room filled with the laughter of people you thought you knew. It happened on a chilly Saturday in February of Sophie's 13th birthday. I'd spent the week hunting for the perfect gift, settling on an iPhone she'd wanted for months, dipping deep into my savings because in my mind, this was the year she'd finally see me, not just as her dependable aunt, but as someone who remembered, who cared. The house was crowded, Noah and Alyssa chatting with friends in the living room, my parents shuffling back and forth from kitchen to den, cousins squabbling over the last slice of pizza. I hovered at the edge as usual, unnoticed, except when someone needed napkins or an extra chair set up. When Sophie unwrapped the phone, her face lit up. I felt a small secret burst of pride. She looked up at me, and in front of the whole room, 30 voices buzzing. Nobody really listening. She said, "Mom says if you disappeared tomorrow, no one would even notice." The words came out so lightly, so casual, that it took me a moment to realize she meant me. People laughed. My sister-in-law smirked, half interested in her wine. My mother's shoulders lifted, a gesture of approval or maybe indifference. My father, always ready with a joke, grinned and said, "Well, she's not wrong." The moment was over before it began. The party moved on, but I stood frozen by the cake table, the gift still in Sophie's hands, my heart pounding like I'd run a race. There are 100 ways families can wound you, but the wounds that hurt the most are the ones nobody sees. For the rest of the evening, I moved through the house like a ghost, watching the party swirl around me. Every word spoken seemed to echo that sentence. If you disappeared, would anyone care? Would the lights still come on? Would the fridge be stocked, the bills paid, the holidays planned, the birthdays remembered? Did anyone really see me? Or had I become so woven into the background that my absence would feel like nothing more than a breeze through an open window? It's easy in American culture to brush off this kind of moment. We're taught to toughen up, to let things slide, to believe that family means forgiveness, even when forgiveness isn't asked for. But there's a cruelty in these small moments, a message that you're replaceable, unremarkable, useful, but ultimately invisible. I remembered friends who'd confided similar stories. A cousin who'd been left off the guest list for her own parents' anniversary party. A colleague who received a group text about a family wedding she was never invited to. We laugh these things off, pretend we're above it. But somewhere deep inside, a seed of doubt takes root. That night, as everyone gathered around the cake to sing, I slipped away. I pulled my coat from the hook and stepped outside into the biting February air. I didn't make a scene, didn't slam the door or shout for attention. Instead, I let the cold wake me up to a possibility I'd never considered before. Maybe I could disappear. Maybe I could take myself out of the equation and see what, if anything, would really change. I drove home through empty streets, my mind replaying Sophie's words, my father's laughter, my mother's silence. By the time I reached my apartment, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I was happy, but because the weight I'd been carrying had finally shifted. In that quiet, something inside me broke and healed at once. I made a cup of tea, turned off my phone, and let myself sit with the sadness. It was the first time I didn't try to fix it. I didn't write a list of ways to do better or wonder how I'd failed. I simply felt the ache, allowed myself to admit that I wanted more. Not more responsibility, not more chances to prove myself, just more space to be seen, to be valued for who I was, not what I could give. That night, I realized the difference between being needed and being loved. It was a small private revolution. If there's a lesson here, it's this. We teach people how to treat us, not just through our words, but through what we're willing to accept. Casual cruelty only takes root where kindness is mistaken for permission. When you realize your kindness has become the background music of someone else's comfort, it's okay to step away. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. You deserve to be celebrated, not just tolerated. That single sentence meant as a joke, a throwaway line became the dividing line in my story. It was the last straw, the quiet shove I needed to consider a life outside the orbit of people who could laugh at my absence. I didn't know in that moment what would come next, but I knew for the first time that I wouldn't wait for someone else to invite me to the table. I was ready at last to consider what it might mean to choose myself. The next part of my story begins with a decision, the first steps toward reclaiming my boundaries, and the slow, courageous act of stepping away. When I look back on that winter, I realized the most radical thing I did was nothing at all, at least not at first. There were no fireworks, no dramatic speeches, just a slow, careful shift from always saying yes to quietly, steadfastly saying no. The hardest part wasn't cutting off my family, it was cutting off the part of myself that still longed for their approval. That longing ran deep like a song I'd carried since childhood. Its melody built from every moment I'd been praised for being the strong one, the reliable one, the helper. It's not easy to set that down, even when you know it's hurting you. But change rarely comes all at once. For me, it began with questions whispered into the dark. What if I stopped answering every call? What if I took a weekend for myself? What if I chose my own peace over someone else's comfort? At first, the urge to step in was almost automatic. The week after Sophie's birthday, Noah called about a late bill. Alyssa asked for help picking up groceries. I started to type my usual reply, "Of course I can do that," then paused. Instead, I wrote, "I'm sorry, I can't, this time." My fingers trembled as I hit send. The silence that followed was sharper than any argument. It's funny how quickly people notice when your boundaries appear, even if they never noticed your sacrifices. My mother called, her voice coated in concern. "Is everything okay, Harper? You seem distant." I wanted to explain to reassure, but I remembered how quickly concern had always turned into expectation. So I simply said, "I'm fine, Mom. I just need some time for myself." That was the truth, and the most difficult truth I'd spoken in years. Saying no didn't come naturally, not at first. There was guilt, of course, a heavy, sticky feeling, as if I were breaking an unspoken contract. But I began to realize that guilt was not the same as wrongdoing. It was simply the discomfort of doing something new, of disrupting a pattern that had long kept everyone else comfortable, but left me empty. I started small, carving out weekends for long walks at Nichols Arboretum, reading books I'd put off for years, joining a pottery class just because I'd always wanted to try. I watched the world in slow motion, learning to hear my own thoughts again. Sometimes I'd feel a pang of loneliness, but it was a clean kind of ache, softer somehow than the pain of being taken for granted. In those moments, I learned that solitude could be a sanctuary, not a sentence. Boundaries are tricky, especially in families where roles are set like concrete. There were days I doubted myself, replaying old conversations in my mind. Was I being selfish? Would they stop loving me if I stopped being useful? I thought about a friend from work, Jenna, who'd gone through something similar after her divorce. "You have to teach people how to treat you," she'd told me. "Otherwise, they'll just keep taking." I clung to that advice. When Noah tried to guilt me into paying for a new car repair, I suggested he call Dad or find a payment plan. When Alyssa dropped hints about needing a sitter, I gently said I was busy that night. It didn't take long for the requests to grow less frequent or for the calls to shift from needs to silence. My family didn't rage or cry, they just paused, unsure what to do with a Harper who no longer filled every gap. There's a myth in American culture that says the most loving thing you can do is give until you're empty. But I began to see that love, real love, should replenish, not deplete. In stepping back, I wasn't abandoning my family. I was inviting them to grow. I realized that by always being there to fix things, I'd kept them from finding their own resilience. Sometimes the greatest gift you can offer is the space for others to stumble, to struggle, and to discover what they're capable of without your constant safety net. It was not a punishment, but a kind of trust. a belief that they could rise to the challenge just as I had all my life. The lesson I learned was simple, but hard-won boundaries are not walls but bridges to a healthier kind of connection, one where everyone carries their share. As spring approached, my resolve grew stronger. I felt lighter, more myself than I had in years. I kept my distance not out of anger, but out of necessity. I paid my own bills, tended to my apartment, nurtured small joys that belonged to me alone. There were awkward silences at family dinners, fewer texts, some sideways glances. But there was also a subtle shift, my mother asking Noah instead of me to bring dessert. Alyssa taking Sophie to her doctor's appointment without expecting my help. Little by little, the household found new rhythms. I realized that my absence wasn't a tragedy. It was a gentle nudge for everyone to step into roles they'd long avoided. The more I honored my own boundaries, the more the world seemed to respect them too. Of course, not all changes are welcomed with grace. There were moments of confusion, even bitterness. Late-night voicemails, long emails, questioning my motives, hints of selfishness or coldness. But each time I was tempted to apologize or justify, I remembered that my worth was not measured by my usefulness. I was more than the roles I'd played, more than the comfort I'd provided. I was for the first time learning to stand in my own light. And though it frightened me, it also filled me with hope. For every goodbye to an old pattern, there was the possibility of a new beginning. That new beginning arrived sooner than I expected, not with a bang, but a slow unraveling of the old order. When I finally stepped away, even quietly, the ripple traveled through my family. Suddenly, all the small crises, the unpaid bills, forgotten appointments, holiday plans began to pile up. It was as if my absence had drawn a chalk outline around all the invisible work I'd done for years. At first, I felt guilty watching them scramble, but gradually I saw something else. The first signs of responsibility, of self-sufficiency, even of gratitude. My boundaries were not just for me, they were for them too. That's how I learned that sometimes letting go is the bravest love of all. And as the dust settled, I prepared myself for what would come next, the family's reckoning with life without their silent caretaker. The shift was coming, and I could only hope that in the empty space I'd left behind, everyone, myself included, would finally learn how to stand on their own. When you spend years holding up the sky for others, it's easy to believe the weather will be just fine without you. But the first thing I noticed after I truly stepped back was how quickly the little things began to slip. At first, the signs were almost invisible. A late payment here, a missed appointment there, a dinner left uncooked because everyone assumed someone else would do it. For so long, I'd managed the household background music calendars, reminders, errands, insurance renewals, even pest control. When I went quiet, those tasks didn't just vanish. They landed in the silence, waiting for someone else to catch them. The world didn't fall apart overnight, but tiny cracks appeared in the veneer of our family's routine. It started with Sophie's school. One Thursday morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Alyssa. "Do you know why Sophie's tuition didn't go through?" she asked, her tone tight with frustration. For years, I'd quietly transferred funds to fill the gap, never asking for thanks. This time, I simply replied, "I'm not sure, maybe check with the office." The next week, Noah called in a panic about an overdue utility bill. "The lights are flickering, did you forget to pay?" I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. I hadn't forgotten. I'd simply stopped. At dinner, my mother looked tired, asking me if I'd rescheduled her doctor's appointment. "No, Mom," I said softly. "You'll have to call them yourself." The confusion in her eyes cut deeper than any accusation. As the weeks passed, the dominoes began to fall. The cable went out just as Noah's favorite team was playing in the playoffs. Alyssa complained about a grocery delivery gone missing. My father grew grumpy when his pharmacy app wouldn't process his refill. He'd always assumed the system just remembered him. Holidays, once orchestrated in the background, now felt chaotic. Schedules clashed, dishes piled up, plans unraveled at the last minute. There was no one left to smooth over disagreements, to fill the gaps with gentle reminders and patient logistics. The tasks that had been invisible when I did them became glaring in their absence, like burned-out bulbs in a familiar room. The family's response shifted quickly from confusion to frustration, then to subtle blame. "It's not like you to be so distant." "Harper," my mother said one afternoon, her voice caught somewhere between worry and accusation. "Noah never one for texted, 'I don't get why you're doing this. We're supposed to be a team.'" Alyssa stopped calling altogether, leaving clipped voicemails instead. I heard my name in the background of conversations I was never invited to join. The silence that followed my refusal to help felt different from solitude. It was heavy charged, sometimes cruel. There were moments I questioned myself, wondering if I'd asked too much by asking for nothing at all. But something else began to happen quietly and almost imperceptibly. My family, shaken out of their habits, started to adapt at first, clumsily, then with small sparks of competence. My mother wrote out her own calendar, asking the doctor's receptionist to repeat instructions until she understood. Noah learned how to pay his bills online, grumbling all the while, but getting it done. Alyssa started making lists for the grocery store, asking Sophie to help pack lunches. The house didn't run as smoothly, and there were more arguments, but the sky didn't fall. Instead, new skills emerged, where there had only been reliance. It was uncomfortable sometimes, painful, but in those awkward gaps, I saw a glimmer of resilience. The people I'd been protecting for so long were finally reluctantly learning to protect themselves. If there's a lesson I'd offer anyone in my place, it's this. Sometimes letting others stumble is the only way they learn to stand. We think love is about cushioning every fall, but real love is believing others can pick themselves up. My boundaries weren't a punishment, they were an invitation for my family to grow. Of course, this process wasn't easy or neat. There were setbacks, moments of anger, even a few heated arguments. But for the first time, everyone in the Lane family had to confront what had been happening for years, that the cost of their comfort had been my invisibility. The cracks in our routines were an honest reflection of the cracks that had long run through our relationships. As spring deepened, I watched from a gentle distance as new rhythms emerged in my absence. It wasn't the effortless harmony I'd always tried to maintain, but it was real lopsided. Sometimes messy, but real. My father learned to fix small things around the house. My mother started cooking again, rediscovering old recipes she hadn't made in years. Even Sophie, who'd once relied on me for every school project, began organizing her own assignments. I realized with a bittersweet ache that in stepping away, I'd given them the chance to be the family they could become, not the family I'd been desperately patching together. Sometimes love means letting go. Of course, not everything was solved by distance. Old resentments simmered and the urge to slip back into old patterns never fully faded. But as I spent more evenings in my own apartment reading, walking, finding comfort in solitude, I felt a deepening sense of peace. I didn't have to be everything to everyone. The work I'd done in secret had left its mark even if no one had said thank you. Still, there was one last truth waiting to surface, the evidence of all those years of sacrifice quietly collected and nearly forgotten. It was time to make the invisible visible, to reveal what love and labor had built in the dark. And as the next chapter unfolded, I knew that letting the truth come to light would change everything for me and for my family. There comes a point after years of quietly holding things together when silence becomes too heavy to bear. I never set out to make a scene. All I wanted was a little space, a little recognition, a gentler rhythm to my days. But as my family adjusted, sometimes clumsily, sometimes resentfully, to life without my invisible labor, I realized something crucial. True change can't happen in the shadows. We can only rewrite the stories we're willing to tell out loud. That's what led me one cool afternoon in May to gather up the folder I'd kept for years at the back of my closet. Inside were printed bills, bank statements, tuition receipts, each one a small marker of the work I'd done mostly without credit or fanfare. There was a flash drive too full of emails, reminder notes, and voicemails, including one from my grandmother on the day she'd decided to leave the family's old lake house in my name. For years, I'd carried this evidence as private reassurance, a shield against the little voice that sometimes whispered, "You're just imagining things, maybe it really isn't that much." But seeing it all laid out, every utility paid, every favor rendered, made the years snap into focus. This wasn't a grudge or a tally. It was the honest record of a life spent giving. When the moment felt right after another missed birthday, another group photo posted online without me, I packed the folder into a plain black bag and left it on my parents' doorstep. I didn't ring the bell or wait around. I knew in the gentle way you know the weather is changing, that the time for confrontation had finally arrived. That evening, the calls started first from my mother, then from Noah, then even from Alyssa, who rarely called me at all. The initial messages were confused. "What is this? Harper, did you mean to leave this? Is everything okay?" I didn't answer right away. I wanted them to sit with it first, to look through every page and piece together, the hidden mosaic of my care. For once, I let the truth speak without my voice. My family's reaction unfolded like a slow-motion film. At first, they seemed almost amused, joking about my Harper files and teasing each other for their own oversights. But as they read through the details, the tone shifted. My father grew quiet, tracing each yellow sticky note and recalculating the math in his head. My mother started to cry, not loudly, but with the soft, shaking tears of someone seeing something for the first time. Noah, for all his bravado, simply sat back in his chair and stared at the wall a little paler than before. Even Alyssa texted, "I didn't realize how much you did for us. I'm sorry." It wasn't a parade or a speech, but in those silent acknowledgments, I felt something release inside me, a knot I hadn't known I'd been carrying. It's a strange, vulnerable thing to lay out the receipts of your life. In American culture, we're taught that kindness shouldn't keep score, that true love is selfless and silent. And yes, it's beautiful to give without expectation. But sometimes, the absence of acknowledgement becomes its own quiet violence, a way of erasing someone while still depending on them. My evidence wasn't about shame or revenge. It was about clarity, about saying, this is what I gave. This is what was asked. I thought of all the times I'd worried I was being dramatic or petty for feeling used. But as my family sat with the truth, I realized that we'd all been trapped by the myth that some people are just meant to give endlessly. I was done with that myth. I wanted a new story, one with room for everyone, including me. If there's a lesson in this, it's that transparency is a gift, not just to others, but to yourself. You don't need to hide your work, your history, or the boundaries you've chosen to set. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply show up with the facts and let the world adjust. Not everyone will respond with gratitude or grace. Some will feel exposed, others will look away, still others will rush to repair the narrative before anyone else finds out. But you at least will know you told the truth, and in that honesty, you'll find a freedom sweeter than any quiet sacrifice. After a few days, the dust began to settle. My mother called to ask if we could talk, voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Noah sent an email more formal than his usual texts, offering to take me out to dinner, just the two of us. I accepted not because I wanted apologies, but because I was ready to meet them as myself, not as the family's safety net. I had nothing left to hide, and for the first time in my life, nothing left to prove. The world felt different, not because my family had changed overnight, but because I had. I was finally learning what it meant to stand on the side of my own life, to tell my story out loud. Still, I sensed that the real test was yet to come. In every family, there's a moment when the truth once whispered in kitchens and behind closed doors finds its way into the open. Sometimes it happens at a dinner table, sometimes at a crowded event, sometimes online for everyone to see. For me, the moment was just a public showdown, not out of spite, but out of the quiet necessity to reclaim the narrative of who I was and what I was worth. That's where my story turns next to a place where honesty meets courage, and where I would finally learn that my voice, steady, clear, and kind, was more powerful than I'd ever believed. I'd always thought that telling the truth would feel like freedom, like the first breath after holding it in for too long. But standing in front of my family at the community center that June, I realized truth can also feel like trembling. The town's annual Founders Day picnic was meant to be a celebration tables, groaning with potato salad laughter, tumbling across the green local kids lined up for sack races. It was the kind of event I'd organized in years past, quietly ensuring every detail fell into place. This year, though, I'd come only as a guest. For once, I was not the one with the clipboard and the sign-up sheets. My family was there, scattered among neighbors and friends, catching up on town news, passing Sophie from lap to lap. I'd meant to keep things simple, to make small talk, enjoy the sunshine, maybe slip away before the evening bonfire. But old habits die hard. Halfway through the afternoon, someone handed me the microphone for the prize raffle, just as Sophie's voice piped up, "Give it to Aunt Harper. She does everything." The words were meant to be kind, but I saw my mother stiffen, saw Noah and Alyssa exchange glances. For a moment, I nearly faded back into the background. But then I remembered the file I'd handed over weeks ago, the evidence that had already cracked our family's old stories. Something in me stood up straight. I took the microphone, but instead of reading the ticket numbers, I found myself saying, "I'd like to share something before we start." I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. Sometimes in families, the person who makes everything work isn't always the one you see. For a long time, that was me. I used to think that being helpful would eventually mean being valued, but I've learned that it's not the same. I want to thank everyone who shows up quietly, the neighbors who mow the lawn for someone sick, the parents who pack lunches for kids who aren't their own, the people who work behind the scenes. I hope today we can notice them too. There was a pause, then a ripple of applause. My family stared at me silent. It wasn't a call out or a confrontation, just a simple public acknowledgement that invisibility has a cost. Afterward, I felt both lighter and raw. Some people came up to thank me for my words. A neighbor squeezed my hand and said, "I always knew you were the heart of your family." My mother said nothing, but I saw tears in her eyes as she hugged Sophie. Noah was stiff, embarrassed perhaps, or simply at a loss. For the first time, I didn't rush to fix the discomfort. I let it settle, let people feel what they needed to feel. That evening, social media was awash with photos from the event, kids with painted faces, families holding up picnic plates, and a short video clip of me at the microphone, my voice clear and steady. Someone tagged me. "Thank you, Harper, for reminding us who makes a community strong." The truth I discovered ripples outward. For years, I'd worried that speaking up would look like bitterness or scorekeeping, but the opposite happened. Several friends reached out with their own stories: an aunt who always cleaned up after family gatherings, a brother who'd quietly paid the mortgage when no one else could. We laughed, sometimes cried over the ways we'd learned to measure our worth by our usefulness. Slowly, I realized that sharing my story wasn't just for me. It gave others permission to see their own invisible work, to claim credit, to set boundaries. Vulnerability, I learned, is how healing begins, not in a vacuum, but in community. If there's a lesson in all this, it's that reclaiming your narrative isn't about blaming or shaming anyone else. It's about taking back the right to tell your story, to let the world see you as more than a supporting character. We all deserve to be recognized, not for what we provide, but for who we are. My family didn't change overnight. There were still awkward silences, lingering hurts, and more than a few stubborn habits. But something essential had shifted. I was no longer afraid to be seen, and I was no longer willing to let my life be written by anyone else. The bonfire that night was bright against the indigo sky. I watched as neighbors toasted marshmallows and Sophie danced with her friends, her laughter raising over the music. For once, I felt like a real part of the scene, not just a stagehand. My parents left early, Noah and Alyssa drifting behind them. I stood for a while, breathing in the cool night air, letting the heat from the fire sink into my skin. For the first time in years, I felt peaceful, even as uncertainty loomed ahead. The next chapter would be about what comes after the truth, the slow work of healing, of rebuilding, of learning to belong to myself before anyone else. And so, as the crowd thinned and the embers glowed, I walked home alone, not lonely, but whole, carrying with me the knowledge that my story, at last, was my own. The work wasn't done. There were more hard conversations ahead, more boundaries to keep, more nights when the past would ache a little. But now I had the tools to meet those challenges with honesty and heart. And that I realized was the greatest prize of all. The days after Founders Day moved both slower and lighter, as if I'd stepped into a world where the air was just a bit clearer. For a while, I waited for the sky to fall, for angry texts, for icy silence, for someone in my family to lash out at me for what I'd said. But instead, what I found was a strange, uncertain quiet. My mother called, her voice gentler than I remembered. She asked how I was, how work was going, if I was eating well. For a moment, we simply talked with no hidden requests behind her words. Noah, for his part, didn't say much, but he did send a card in the mail. A photo of us as kids, scribbled with a hesitant, "Thank you for everything, Harp." I'm sorry I never said it before. There was no grand apology, no big family meeting, just these small new gestures, a different kind of recognition, tentative but real. Not everything healed at once. Some wounds remain tender, and sometimes I still catch the edge of an old ache when I see a group photo without me or hear about a family plan made without my knowing. But the difference is, I no longer chase those moments. I let them be what they are. My absence is no longer a punishment or a plea. It's a choice to give myself the same care I once lavished on others. I spend weekends wandering farmers markets, trying out new recipes, meeting up with friends who fill my days with laughter. There's a new rhythm to my solitude, one I fill with books, with music, with long walks along the Huron River. Sometimes I still feel a pang for what could have been, but mostly I feel relief for what no longer is. The biggest surprise, perhaps, was how my family began to grow in my absence. With the safety net gone, they learned to manage, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes well. My mother joined a local book club, filling her evenings with stories and company she hadn't sought in years. Noah took on more responsibility at home, even organizing a birthday party for Sophie on his own. He sent me photos, a quiet nod to the old ways, but no request for help. Alyssa and I found a cautious truce, our conversations growing more honest, less transactional. We are not the perfect picture of healing, but we are different, and that is enough. Looking back, I see that letting go was never about abandoning anyone. It was about setting all of us free from patterns that no longer served us. In American culture, the myth of the selfless caretaker runs deep. But real love, I've learned, leaves room for everyone to grow. We cannot heal what we pretend not to feel, and we cannot change what we're afraid to name. By letting myself feel the cost of my old life, the loneliness, the exhaustion, the invisibility, I made space for something new, mutual respect, honest conversation, and the slow rebuilding of trust. Healing, I've discovered, isn't a destination. It's a practice, a series of choices made day by day, sometimes hour by hour. If there's a lesson here, it's that healing doesn't erase the past. It honors it, learns from it, and then gently lays it down. The cost of letting go was steep, but the gift was clarity, the knowledge that I can write my own story, even if some chapters are painful or unfinished. Now, when I look in the mirror, I see not just the reliable daughter or the helpful sister, but a whole person, someone worth loving, someone allowed to take up space. That's the gift I offer to anyone listening. Your life is yours. Your worth isn't measured by your sacrifices, and it's never too late to start again. As the seasons turned, I felt ready to welcome the next chapter. Not because everything had healed, but because I had finally made peace with the process. The empty spaces at family gatherings are no longer empty. They are invitations, possibilities, reminders of how far we've all come. It's time now to build something new, to fill those spaces with chosen family, with self-made traditions, with a life that reflects the person I fought to become. And so with gratitude and a steady heart, I step forward, ready for what comes next. Moving into the old lake house felt like stepping into another life, a quieter, slower one defined by the sound of water against the shore and wind in the trees. It was the same house my grandmother had left me, the one whose deed I'd carried for years, tucked away like a secret. The first morning sunlight crept across the floorboards and caught dust motes swirling in the air. I stood in the empty living room boxes still stacked in the corners and felt a complicated tangle of emotions, relief, fear, excitement, and a gentle sadness for all the years I'd waited for this moment. There were repairs to be made. Of course, the faucet dripped, the windows rattled in the wind, and the porch needed painting. But for the first time, the work felt like a gift I was giving myself, not a debt I owed someone else. I spent the first week simply settling in and unpacking books, hanging photos, learning which light switches worked and which creaked. I planted wildflowers in the front garden, coaxed an old radio to life, and invited neighbors over for coffee on the porch. My world became smaller and richer. There was a pleasure in making soup just for myself, in choosing paint colors without compromise, in sitting quietly by the water at sunset. At first, the silence felt unfamiliar, but slowly it became my own, a backdrop for reflection, not loneliness. On Sundays, I'd walk the trail that circled the lake, greeting fishermen and families, sometimes exchanging a few words, sometimes just a wave. The community here was gentle and undemanding, and that was exactly what I needed. With time, I found myself opening up to new connections. I joined a local writers group at the library where every week we shared stories and really listened to each other. There were no unspoken expectations, no invisible ledgers to keep. One afternoon, I met Linda, a retired teacher who invited me to help with the town's annual craft fair. I found myself laughing, making friends, offering help because I wanted to, not because it was expected. This new circle didn't replace my family, but it added something essential, a sense of belonging that came with choice, not obligation. I discovered, as so many do, that family is not just the people you're born to, but the people you find along the way, those who see you, celebrate you, and let you grow. Sometimes the old pain resurfaced, a phone call from Noah, a holiday invitation that felt both warm and uncertain, a quiet pang when I saw families gathered at the lake. But now I could meet those moments with softness, not desperation. My relationships with my family changed, less frequent, more honest and grounded in a new kind of respect. My mother and I spoke about books and gardens instead of favors. Noah learned to stand on his own, and Sophie sent me letters about her adventures. We were not as close as before, but we were perhaps more real. The empty space I'd feared turned out to be a canvas, not a void. If there's a lesson at the end of this long story, it's that freedom and connection can grow side by side. Letting go of old roles allowed me to claim my own joy, and it offered my family the chance to do the same. The hardest truths were not punishments, but invitations to honesty, to change to a deeper kind of love. I learned that it's possible to forgive, not by forgetting, but by understanding everyone is shaped by their own patterns, their own hurts. The best we can do is choose every day to show up for ourselves and for others with as much gentleness as we can muster. Now, as I sit on the porch of Willow Lake, coffee in hand and the sun setting over the water, I am struck by how far I've come. There are new birthdays to celebrate new friendships, to nurture new traditions, to build ones that honor who I am and who I hope to be. The journey isn't over. There are still hard days, still old habits to resist, still moments when doubt creeps in, but I am no longer invisible. I am here, I am whole, and I am writing the rest of my story on my own terms. So to anyone listening who has ever felt unseen or unappreciated, who has carried more than their share and wondered if it was enough, you are already enough. You are worthy of the space you take up and the dreams you hold close. Family can be chosen, love can be learned, and it is never too late to build a life that feels like home. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. May you find your own Willow Lake in whatever form it takes, a place where your story is yours and your heart can finally rest. Harper's journey is one so many of us recognize, a path of quiet giving, invisible labor, and longing for a place at the table. Through her years of sacrifice, she became the backbone of her family, her needs and dreams gently erased beneath the weight of expectation. When a single careless comment exposed how unseen she truly was, Harper made the courageous choice to set boundaries, let go, and begin again. As her family learned to stand on their own, Harper rebuilt her life at Willow Lake, embracing solitude, chosen community, and a sense of self-worth she'd long denied. Her story is a testament to the power of reclaiming your narrative, honoring your own needs, and discovering that family can be found and built where you are truly seen. If you saw yourself in Harper's story, know that you are not alone. It is never too late to set healthy boundaries, to claim your voice, and to nurture a life that feels like your own. Whether you are the silent helper or someone just learning to notice those who give quietly, take a moment today to honor your worth and the worth of those around you. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, or tell us in the comments how you're rewriting your own story. Remember, your voice matters. Your story matters. And every small act of self-love is a step toward a future where you are truly at home.